Yes. So let me formally welcome all of you to this Friday webinar series that EGROW has organized. As you are aware, EGROW for nearly 2.5 years has been organizing webinar series on contemporary issues. We have had a privilege of having a very healthy blend of speakers from India and abroad, of speakers and scholars, researchers from India and those from abroad. We have also been very lucky to have two Nobel laureates speak at this forum. We are now in midst of a budget season. In just about a week's time, we are going to have the economic survey and the union budget. This union budget, as you know, is a very important budget because the impact will last for nearly 2 years. This is the last full-time budget of this government. And then we get into election mode next year. And then we'll have an interim budget, and then we'll have another interim. And it'll be only in February 2025 that we'll now have the next full-time budget, full year, full-term budget. So much is happening across the world, very aggressive monetary policy being pursued all over the world, including India. What would be the budget like? What should be the budget like? What can the FM be really offering us? We are all here to talk and discuss this. To do so and lead us in the discussion today, we have Professor Ravindra Dholakia. He is a very well-known name in the economic circles, very well-known economist. He has been on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank. He has also been on a number of committees. And right now, he is on the board of the Reserve Bank. As we all know, he has spent long years at the IIM Ahmedabad and published extensively. His own publications on inflation and monetary policy issues are known to all of us. With this, I hand over the session to Professor Dholakia to conduct the proceedings. The only announcement that I want to make at this point is this is a pre-budget discussion. We are coming post-budget discussion exactly with the same team, same format. So next 3 hours, 90 minutes today and 90 minutes on February 3, we are going to have the benefit of the analysis of the fiscal policy and the budget from the best minds that our country has. Dr. Dholakia, please.
Charan, thank you very much. But would you like to introduce briefly the speakers also on the panel?
I can certainly do that. I can certainly do that. Give me half a second. So other than Professor Dholakia, we are going to have a panel which consists of Surjit Bhalla. Surjit Bhalla is advisor to EGROW Foundation. And you also know that he's been the former executive director to the International Monetary Fund, where he was representing India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Bhutan. He's a well-known economist in our country. He's published extensively. He's been writing regular columns, taking part in various debates, and I think leading some of the debates in our country. His latest paper on poverty and the programs of the government during COVID, I think is path-breaking, and much has been discussed about that paper. He's been on the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council earlier. Then we have Professor Sawhney. Professor Sawhney is a professor, chairperson, and coordinator of UGC Special Assistance Program at Department of Economics, Punjab University, Chandigarh. She was a Fulbright Nehru Fellow. She also serves as convener, Jawaharlal Nehru Chair, and Dr. Manmohan Singh Chair at Punjab University since April 2016. She has been a member of the Regional Advisory Group at NABARD and has taught a course on intercultural management development process of the Indian economy at the University of Werburg, Germany. She has been extensively working with the finance commissions, and she has been on our forum earlier too. We have Professor Gayithri. Professor Gayithri Karnam is now with the Fiscal Policy Institute, but for many years she was a professor at ISAC in the Center for Economic Studies and Policy. She specializes in the area of public economics, industrial economics, and public policy studies. She has worked with us extensively earlier. She did a paper for us, and which I thought was a very good paper on India in 2047, the fiscal policy. So she has also worked extensively with international agencies. She's worked as a consultant to international donor agencies like USAID and DFID in state level fiscal studies. She is specialized in state level fiscal studies actually. She has been a recipient of Shastri Indo-Canadian Faculty Research Fellowship twice to undertake comparative fiscal studies at the Carleton University, Canada. She has undergone training at the Duke Center for International Development, Duke University, on aspects relating to public budgeting and financial management. She has also extensively published, and she has also participated in the executive education program on public financial management in a changing world at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Howard University, Boston. She's not here right now, but I'm expecting her any minute. We have Pinaki Chakraborty with us. He is the former director, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, New Delhi. Prior to this, he was the chief social policy UNICEF and the chief of field office UNICEF Kerala in Tamil Nadu. Since 2008, he has been professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, Delhi. He has served as member advisory council to the 15th Finance Commission of India. He was member secretary committee on fiscal statistics appointed by the National Statistical Commission in 2017, chairman Kerala Public Expenditure Review Committee, a statutory committee appointed by the government of Kerala, and research associate Levi Economics Institute, New York. From May 2013 to December 2014, Pinaki served as the economic advisor to the 14th Finance Commission of India, heading the Economic Analysis and Technical Coordination Division of the Commission. He is a specialist in public finance of the national and state governments and has served on the advisory committees of various research institutions in our country. He has testified in the Upper House of India, Parliament in June 2015 on the Constitution Amendment Bill on GST. So he has participated extensively in public debate on public finance. Ajit Pai, a dear friend of mine, he is the chairman Delhi Urban Art Commission and strategy lead partner for government and public sector at Ernst Young Strategy and Transaction Group. Prior to this, he was distinguished expert at Niti Aayog, where we started to know him and look at his work, where he headed economics and finance, oversaw public disinvestment and public enterprises, was consultant to the vice chairman, and handled matters related to the World Bank, IMF, IFC, IMF, ADB, NDB, OECD, and G20. Previously, he has had a career in the private sector for long years, including working internationally at firms like McKinsey, Lazard, Thomas Weisel Partners, and Stifel Financial, the latter two as managing director. He has been awarded over 6 years a record 5 times Star Mine Awards in the Forbes and Financial Times World's Best Analyst Survey for forecast accuracy. And you know, forecast accuracy is a damn challenging task. Ajit holds a B.Arch from the School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi, an M.Arch from the Yale School of Architecture, and an MBA from the Yale School of Management. He attended Yale University as a Tata Scholar and also served as a John Olin Fellow for Research in Markets and Regulatory Behavior. His active interests include architecture, design, anthropology, urbanism, planning, history, economic development, sustainability, horticulture, finance, technology, policy, and governance. Dharmakirti Joshi is currently the chief economist at CRISIL. We requested him specially so that he brings in the market perspective for us today. He has about 30 years experience in economic research and consultancy career and consultancy. Career began in NCER where he spent 11 years. That's a long time. He then moved on to senior positions in Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, New Delhi, and CRISIL, an S&P Global company. He has extensive experience in macroeconomic analysis, mid-term assessment of Indian economy, and forecasting, as well as in public finance issues at the center and state levels. He has been a consultant to the state governments on fiscal issues. He is currently member of working group on revision of WPI set up by the Government of India. He holds a master's degree in economics from Punjab University, Chandigarh. He has attended programs on macroeconomic policy and management at Howard University and was a visiting scholar to Economic Research Unit of University of Pennsylvania. He is also the chairman of Economic Affairs Group Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry and member of the Economic Affairs Council of Confederation of Indian Industry. He has also co-authored a number of books and has several research articles to his credit. That's the team which we have invited, and we are fortunate that they have agreed to be with us today. With this, I hand over the session to Professor Dholakia to conduct the proceedings.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, it seems that we are left with about 75 minutes altogether, and we have very distinguished panels of about there are echoes. I mean, is there a so I would request every member to confine their comments and their observations to about 7 to 8 minutes each, and then if possible we can have some questions at the end. I think that should be fine, right? About 7 to 8 minutes each. I'll provide my brief comments towards the end. However, just to kickstart the things, as Charan has already pointed out, that this budget is likely to be the last budget, full-fledged budget before the election kicks in. And there are serious challenges given the fact that we are as a nation targeting $5 trillion $5 trillion economy by the year 26-27 by now. And in the longer run, we are targeting about 10 trillion economy by 2033-34. If that is the kind of a thing, then growth is a very important concern. Inflation has been a concern, and that is the concern that RBI is supposed to be dealing with. However, there is going to be some kind of the proactive measures required from the center in terms of the fiscal policy to address some of these issues which are pertaining to the prices of food grains and the petroleum, which are essentially the things which are not necessarily in the purview of RBI. So these are also the very significant kind of thing. There are issues about the current account deficits, but not so serious. However, there are issues. So that is also another very relevant matter. And finally, the fiscal consolidation has to be a concern. I think these are the concerns which are there. And whatever freedom is left with the finance minister, I mean, what is the view of each of the distinguished panelists? We would like to hear. So I invite Professor Bhalla to start the discussion. Professor Surjit Bhalla.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Dholakia, and it's an honor and pleasure for me to join in on this. I'm just looking at the clock. So let me first start off with something that I've believed for some time now, and especially given the targets that you mentioned of where India is going over the next few years and the next few decades. The first point I want to make is, do we really, I mean, we would have reached middle income status, let alone developed country status, if we don't have a budget day. Most countries around the world do not have secrecy in budget. If you want to think about something that is a leftover from 100 years past, it is this entire tamasha or whatever of a budget. Why can't we move towards consultations at a regular level with consultations at a regular level with the participants, with industry, with the bureaucracy, with the central bank, and come up with a budget like every other country does? So that's my first point, that I think this is a colonial heritage, and the sooner we got away from it, the better off we'll be. Second, and I see many monetary experts around here on inflation, and you mentioned this in your opening comments. I quite honestly don't understand the hullabaloo about inflation, whether in India or in the West. Let me expand on that a little bit, and it's not meant to be a provocative statement, it's meant to be a factual statement, that from the mid-90s to now, what you have is, till 2019, let's take it, a steady declining rate of inflation around the world, such that in 2019, the median inflation in developing economies was only 1 percentage point ahead of the median inflation in the advanced economies. And this is something that has not been seen since about 1960. And 1960, as you know, we didn't have much data on most of parts of the world and so on and so forth. So my humble question to all policymakers, starting from Shaktikant Das to Mr. Powell, etc., around the world, what has changed in the last, between 2019 and now? We know we had a COVID crisis. We know we had supply constraints. We know we had bottlenecks. We know we had lockdowns. We know shipping costs went through the roof, and shipping costs have fallen through the floor. Now, I think, policy making should be about, at least 6 months to 12 months ahead. Now, in that context, what is this that, why should inflation be a problem is something the policymakers need to answer. I don't believe inflation is a problem either in India or anywhere around the world, other than, of course, you can mention Pakistan, you can mention Argentina, etc. But take out the crisis countries, inflation is not a problem and should be not of much concern to policymakers. Then what can we expect from the budget? And, perennial question, I participated like you have, all of you have, for the last 20, 25 years. Will this be a populist budget? Will this cut taxes, etc.? I think a lot of the work has already been done. And I think the one avenue which is really related to the budget is direct taxes and reform of direct taxes. We've reformed indirect taxes. Obviously, there's more to go in terms of the GST and so on and so forth. But really, direct taxes is the only avenue left, a major avenue, except for one other item which has recently cropped up, and which is the Revdi culture, or whatever you want to call it. And the particular form that it has taken now is about the getting back to the old pension system, which I think would be a very, very dangerous trend for the states to go into. And it'd be interesting to get views as to how this would be managed if states go ahead on this freebie, Revdi of the mother of all the AFDs or the king of all the AFDs or the father of all the AFDs. So I think that's, I don't think the budget, I don't expect the budget to make much of a stand on that, but I do think as policymakers, as well as academics, that is something that we should be most concerned about the impending dangerous trend, political trend that is in the offing and especially coming from the states. Last point, which is related, summarizes all of those above points, is that, you know, we should recognize that times have changed, the country has changed, you know, so let us not act in a manner which is what we did for most of the last 75 years. Let us conform to both the India of the present and especially the India of the future. And thank you very much. I think my 7 minutes have also just ended. Yeah.
You have kept to the clock absolutely well, sir. And your points are very well taken. In fact, several of them I cannot agree more. Anyway, let us invite Professor Upinder Sawhney. You are on mute.
Thank you, Professor Dholakia, and thank you, EGROW, for having me for this pre-budget discussion. So I think we all agree that this year's budget comes amidst several challenges, including global slowdown, likely recession, domestic inflation, job cuts, and high fiscal deficit. So since this is the last budget before the general elections and also a number of state elections, it's likely to be populist. However, balancing populism with sound economics is going to be a challenge which the FM is going to face, especially when fiscal space is limited. So I have a few observations or expectations, I should say. The past few years have been unprecedented volatility, and India has outperformed most large economies. My expectation from the budget would be to stimulate demand since we are seeing some slowdown. So the focus has to be on increasing consumption and investment, but controlling inflation. The broad path of fiscal consolidation announced by the government in February 2021 is to reach a fiscal deficit level below 4.5% by 25-26, which is going to be the next full budget for which it is expected that efforts will be made to limit borrowings so that interest liability is not increased further. Disinvestment targets, which have not been met for many years, would be taken up seriously in this budget, and not only the announcements, but also endeavor to achieve it. And I think there is going to be a reduction in food and fertilizer subsidies. In view of inflation and worsening job market, households must get some relief. Middle class salaried people must get some relief. So the tax slabs have remained unchanged since the budget of 2016-17. In order to place more disposable income in the hands of the salaried class, it is expected that income tax limit will be raised and the slabs will be rationalized, as also the highest rate of income tax will be reduced. You know, there are two kinds of income tax regimes right now, and it's difficult for a common man to apprehend. So probably there should only be one, and that is what the FM may strive at. Then, in fact, in order to give more relief to seniors and super seniors, there should be some other related changes in indirect taxes like GST on health expenses, medical and life insurance. Long-term capital gains tax, the non-taxable limit of sale of equities be increased to encourage the flow of investment in the capital market, and simplify the long-term capital gains regime. in order to meet the twin objective of fiscal consolidation and increase in investment and job creation, a substantial increase in capital expenditure, notably on infrastructure, is expected. A manufacturing push would also help the government create more jobs, and it will also uplift India's status as a global hub for goods production. Now, according to this budget, we must see an increase in outlay for production-linked investment scheme as compared to the previous year. The effort has to be on ramping up local manufacturing, and it is also expected that the government will improve the startup ecosystem, which it initiated in 2016, and further ease of doing business for startups is likely to be promoted. And it is also expected, and this is very important because the rural sector is also going through a hard time, and it is expected that the government will increase rural and welfare spending as seen in pre-election budgets. That's normally what has been happening. And one area which is also expected to be brought out in the forthcoming budget is climate change, which has gained prominence across most industries, and the government may not hesitate to boost spending towards promoting sustainable energy resources. The government could announce new schemes and incentives to promote renewable energy resources, and then also maybe some fiscal incentives, higher funding and tax rebates. The government could announce to prompt greater private participation towards climate change and green growth. The primary focus of the budget, to conclude, I would say, is likely to be on job creation and investment-driven growth, measures to stimulate rural spending and infrastructure development would be the highlights in the coming budget. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have also absolutely kept the clock in mind. Thank you very much. May I now invite Dr. Pinaki Chakraborty. Pinaki, you are on mute. Oh, yeah.
Is it okay now?
Yes,
Sorry.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Dholakia. Thanks, Charan, for inviting me. I would like to structure my 7 minutes in 7 minutes to answer 7 questions that I formulated for myself when it comes to this year's budget. The first question is about the fiscal consolidation for 23-24 and vis-a-vis populism, because it's the pre-election year budget. I think the focus area of budget for this year can only be fiscal consolidation and strengthening the framework of macroeconomic stability by reducing debt and deficit. The government will be able to free up resources for development expenditure and capital spending if the debt servicing cost is reduced in the medium term through a reduction in debt to GDP ratio. I think we have an aggregate debt to GDP ratio which is around 87%, taking both center and states, and center share is around 80% of the total. So there is a need to reduce debt at a faster rate as we recover from the COVID shock and other macroeconomic uncertainties posed by the war between Russia and Ukraine. The focus on capital spending in previous 2 years' budget is noteworthy, and I hope this year's budget will continue on the same path. Now, there has been my second question in the context of fiscal expansion to the tax side. Do we really think that there's a scope for cutting income tax rates, given that the demand in the economy is still fragile, as the previous speaker mentioned, and we also have been reading about it in newspapers? I think our peak rate. I have a slightly different view. I think we have our peak rate of income tax at 30%, and which is reasonably low. The post-COVID income tax collection remained buoyant at this rate. And if there is a need to push demand, I think there are other instruments available with the government, and I really do not see the reduction of income tax rate would be the right thing to do. I think it runs the risk of losing revenue. Though rationalization of exemption is necessary, we need a balanced view on rationalization. We need to be all and all exemptions are not bad. We need to be more specific what we want to exempt and what we don't want to exempt. A more nuanced and careful view on exemption is necessary. I am talking about personal income tax. For example, there is a specific economic rationale for giving basic exemption in income tax, and that's done all over the world. And one can always discuss what would be that level of exemptions, but we really cannot have an income tax without a basic exemption limit. So that will have serious implications for horizontal equity. The third question that I wanted to ask myself and discuss here is, why do you see the government's fiscal deficit in current financial year and the next year? So given that revenue growth is buoyant and nominal GDP growth is expected to be higher than what it was assumed for the fiscal year 22-23, the government should be able to achieve fiscal deficit target of 6.4%. I think it will be lower than 6. Probably a bigger correction than the target will. Going forward, fiscal consolidation needs to be, in my view, front-loaded so that the targeted fiscal deficit reduction to 4.5%, which is to be currently achieved by FY26, can be achieved before FY26. That's given the level of debt and given the level of general government deficit, taking both center and states to get together. The next question is the subsidy issue. I think we need to situate explicit subsidy in relation to the total government spending. The total explicit subsidy for the current fiscal year, that is 22-23, is about 3.5 trillion Indian rupees in a budget of 40 trillion rupees. So it accounts for around 9% of total expenditure. Now, if we take FY04, so if we go back to history, 20 years back, the total government expenditure was 4.74 trillion rupees and subsidy was 440 billion, which was again 9.5%. So in a way, the subsidy bill, aggregate subsidy bill, remained at around 9 to 10% of total government spending. It hasn't really increased. The composition of subsidy has changed dramatically. But overall incidence of subsidy on government budget remains same. It hasn't. So this largely depends on the view on subsidy you take. I think what is more important is monitoring implicit subsidies and associated fiscal risk. I think the budget has made a very good beginning 2 years back by bringing small saving related fiscal risk into the fiscal deficit. I think that kind of transparency measures would further improve understanding the fiscal risk associated with the deficit number. I think that is my last question is, what is the kind of position that budget should take with regard to the borrowing demand by the states, given that revenue deficit at the state level has increased? The scope for increasing borrowing limit is very, very limited. I think an appropriate mechanism to protect state level capital expenditure will be more important than increasing the borrowing limit. If we consider general government deficit, it is already quite high. We need to reduce the general government deficit. It's fiscally prudent to remain around 3% of GDP for the states as well as states, and follow the path of fiscal consolidation proposed by the 15th Finance Commission. So. And then I wanted to ask myself whether there is a medium-term fiscal plan, quantified fiscal plan that should be there for the fiscal consolidation, which at the moment is absent because of COVID and other macroeconomic uncertainty. I think that there is rise in revenue at much faster rate than what was assumed in the budget 20 to 23. And GDP growth rate assumed in the budget was 11%. I think nominal GDP growth rate is much faster than, much higher than 11%. I think a substantial part of the fiscal correction can be front-loaded, and in turn we can achieve 4.5% before FY26. Probably that macroeconomic framework would mean faster reduction in deficit, faster reduction in debt, freeing up resources for primary expenditure, and a defined path for medium-term reduction in fiscal deficit and debt would help in this transition. So I stop at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pinaki. You have also stuck to the clock. I'm very happy, and made a very significant points where I don't know whether people will agree or not agree. That we'll see later. Shall I invite Dr. Pai, Ajit Pai?
Good evening, and thank you so much, Dr. Dholakia, and the other speakers, Dr. Charan Singh as well, for some very, very insightful thoughts on the budget and for having me, participate in this. So I think very broadly, when I look at the global economy and I see it decelerating, I share the optimism of everyone else over here that has mentioned the Indian economy outperforming. Many factors for the Indian economy are doing better than the global factors. I think a large part of that, I would say, is that there is the convergence from a longer term perspective that has to happen with higher per capita GDP countries, and a lot of cleanup that has happened in terms of reforms over the past 7 years that have yet to get reflected in the company's fundamentals. So while yes, I think, we have talked about buoyancy in taxes, I think it is not just the recovery in the economy that is resulting in that buoyancy in taxes. It's also a massive formalization that has happened in the Indian economy. And that actually bodes well for India in many ways, because just about 7-8 years ago, only 2% of the country filed tax returns. That's tripled in the past decade as a percentage. And more than the tax revenue, what it gives us is much better visibility into the economy. It helps policymakers understand what's going on. What was also a result of the very, very low level of formalization in the economy was that the private credit in the overall economy was very low. Out of the G20 countries, one of the lowest private credit to GDP ratios was India. And now with this big formalization and still having a per capita GDP that is 1/5 of the world average, 20% of the world average, we are looking at the convergence that can continue to happen. We can support growth rates that are much higher, and the private debt can help over there. The reason why I speak about the private debt also is I agree with a number of the other speakers that have talked about the high government debt. And I believe that baton has to pass from the government spending to private spending. But I still think that spending that occurs should not necessarily be on the consumption side for a country where we are with a massive infrastructure deficit. But that, it should be more investment and more infrastructure related. So we still have a massive infrastructure deficit that makes our enterprises less competitive. That also, not just reduces ease of doing business, but also ease of living. All of that is also under some pressure. So what would ideally, what we'd like to see in this budget when you have buoyancy and, due to formalization, you have buoyancy due to taxes, is that baton, to be passed on by policies towards the private sector. So we'd also like to see that government spending continue to happen. You're seeing some transitions when you're looking even at government spending shifting from roads to railways. The railways impacts our country's efficiency in a massive way. So wherever we have to do it, we'd like to see that railway spending. It used to be a separate budget a few years ago, now combined with the union budget, but we'd like to see that increase quite rapidly. And as much as possible, the policies of the government that have been shifting towards helping the private sector become a bigger part of the economy, we want to see some of that happen. So what are the various tools? One, of course, are tools that have been mentioned like the PLI, the production-linked incentive schemes, that with a small amount of government capital, we are trying to trigger private investment in increasing our manufacturing competitiveness, but also in our public infrastructure, looking at PPP as a model that we have gone slow on, but inviting private participation into what I would call public goods and public infrastructure in a far more active way. So we are seeing some government announcements that have happened there, whether it's railway stations, whether it's a few other things, but if we can see some acceleration there. Two drivers for that. One is, of course, the fact that we want to see very high employment, which remains an issue right now in the country. We want to accelerate the amount of employment that we create. There's a lot of disguised sort of underemployment in the agri sector, where we still have 40% of the workforce engaged. So infrastructure, construction are areas which do have about 5 to 6 times the elasticity, employment elasticity for the same money spent. So that's the reason why we want to see continued investment there, especially going into an election, the last sort of real budget. These things are long cycles, so I think we should see a greater thrust on inviting and incentivizing investment over there, just like with the PLIs, try to create higher private investment, in the near term. And I think the budget is unlikely to disappoint there. One other area, after 3 years of the budget focusing on infrastructure, talking about it quite a bit, where we are hoping that it transitions from more towards rail, is that the last budget talked about urbanization, where India's rate of urbanization is half that of the rest of the world. And urbanization is where you can see that a lot of private capital is deployed. In fact, the ratio is 6 to 1. When you put out infrastructure with the common infrastructure, then what the construction that happens of the private sector, whether it's commercial, homes, etc., its ratio is very high and very high employment there. So I'm hoping that that trend, the efficiencies of agglomeration that are there with urbanization, are being recognized. The Honorable Finance Minister talked about that for the first time in the last budget. We are hoping that that thrust is encouraged in this budget, because we will need, in a slowing economy, we will need to be providing a lot of thrust to employment and actually reducing that infrastructure deficit and improving the efficiencies of the Indian economy in a very, very significant way. So I think overall, what I would say is that from the budget, we'd expect to encourage continuing investment that will create the greatest employment, but the baton to pass towards the railways and things like that, but also from a financing and construction perspective, from the public sector to the private sector. And that fiscal consolidation that was talked about by Dr. Chakraborty, Pinaki Chakraborty, I think is something also I would like to see advanced, because that reduces the cost of capital for the overall economy. Bond rates, people that invest in bonds do look at the financial discipline of the central government. And given the buoyancy, rather than spend it all, I would say that encouraging the private sector to spend it and help it spend it would help us in reducing the overall cost of capital of the Indian economy and continue to accelerate its growth in a more sustainable manner. I will stop over there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajit. I'm very happy. You have also stuck to the clock. Very happy. Now, may I request Dharmakirti, Joshi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dholakia. I hope I'm audible, and Dr. Charan Singh for inviting me. One advantage of coming last is that you can skip over some of the things that have already been said. But I just wanted to highlight one fact that India does remain a growth outlier, and is likely to remain a growth outlier next year as being among the fastest growing large economies. But the slowdown is coming. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about it in 23-24. Three reasons. Number one, the advanced countries are getting into a recession, and India's exports, 45% of them go to advanced countries. So that is going to have a spillover effect via the trade channel. The second, I think, is the fact that central bank has been raising rates, and I think to control inflation. And the only way central banks control inflation is by slowing the economy. So clearly, I think that impact will be felt with a lag, and the peak of that impact will be felt in 23-24. And the third is the geopolitics, which I think typically with a global slowdown, you get crude and commodity prices sliding. But with this messy geopolitics, the decline may not be commensurate with the slowdown in the world economy. So these are the three factors which will slow the economy. And our expectation is that from 15.4% nominal growth in 22-23, it might come down to something like 10.5% or so, and real growth at 6%. Now, I think so. Coming to the challenges for the budget in this environment, I think I agree with the fiscal consolidation aspect. I think we have committed on a glide path. And we need to be on that glide path to 4.5% by 25-26. The issue is how are we going to achieve it? And if you look at last year's budget, they had planned, the strategy was to cut the revenue expenditure and increase the capital expenditure. They were working with something like 11% nominal growth. But all those assumptions were out of the window within 1 month. And I think similar thing happening this year shouldn't be a surprise, because I think we are living in a very uncertain environment with too many moving parts. Now, that last year or in this fiscal year, we were saved because the nominal GDP growth was high, WPI inflation was very high, and as a result, the tax collections turned out to be more buoyant. I think there is compliance has improved, there's no doubt about it. But in addition to that, I think the nominal higher nominal growth also played a role. This year, I think the higher nominal growth is unlikely to play a role, because I think there is a slowdown, as I said, which is coming, and inflation is also going to be lower. So now tax collections are going to be a challenge. So now how do you do fiscal consolidation? So you'll have to do the same strategy that you did last year. Cut the revenue expenditure, and there is some hope that fertilizer prices, naphtha prices, and crude prices, even though they may not come down very sharply, they will come down. So that's going to help government restructure its spending from the revenues towards the capex. Now, I would say that government should keep the pedal on the capex side, because even though private sector is primed up for investments, because they have low leverage, they have enough cash reserves, capacity utilization has improved. But the point is, in an uncertain environment, I think it's not the interest rates which are going to hit them. It's the uncertainty in the system which is not going to allow the animal spirits on the full scale, I mean, in this scenario. So, and government and private investments are not substitutes of each other. I mean, government is investing in infrastructure, private is in manufacturing. So I think for keeping the focus on infrastructure, while also, I think, facilitating private investment, I would say, whether it is through PLI or through some other route, I think you need to fast forward it. So one of the advantages of PLI has been that some of the investments which would have taken place a little later have been fast forwarded. So I think that's keeping the investment cycle strong. So that's the investment side. And finally, I think on the climate issue, as Dr. Upinder also mentioned, see, we are changing our growth model. Services is not that resource intensive. So growth until now has been fired by services. When you move towards infrastructure, you require steel, cement. When you move towards manufacturing, your carbon footprint increases much more. So you'll have to double down on this, because you're also facing tariffs now, likely to face tariffs from Europe, etc. On if your carbon footprint is higher. I mean, so you'll have to, I think, so as a part of the strategy over the medium run, we'll have to adopt a path. So the budget should try to lay out how it's going to do how it plans to do that, because it will require fiscal support, particularly for the small and medium enterprises, which also are in large in number. They contribute to manufacturing and also export. So I think they also have a large carbon footprint, but they don't have the reserves like the large companies to carry out this transition. So I think maybe some sort of green finance for the smaller companies would also help. So let me stop there, but with the last point that the budget will have to be nimble. All the assumptions that you make could be thrown out of the window in next 2 months. So I think you'll have to adapt quickly. And the chances of this time we being helped by higher nominal growth is unlikely.
Thank you very much. You have also kept absolutely good eye on the clock. Now, Charan, are we having Professor Gayithri around?
Professor Gayatri came, listened to almost everybody, and about a minute back, she sent me a message. She's going back into the meeting from where she had extracted herself and come. But she did say that she wanted to highlight the state aspects of the budget and how the state's going to be supported given the challenges that the states would have. And obviously, she reiterated that next week certainly she'll be here and she'll be with us full time next week.
Okay. So that brings the, I mean, the first brief presentations by all the panel members present here. Now, before I open the floor for questions, specific questions to specific speakers, I would rather like to point out a few things. First of all, I fully agree with the remarks made by Professor Surjit Bhalla that probably we need to relook at the kind of exercises that we do for budgeting. Whether we require budget or not is a different issue. In fact, every government requires budget, and he is also not saying that we should not have budget. But the processes and the way it is being presented needs to be having a relook. I think the very fact that the assumptions made last time, at the time of budget, that it will be a nominal growth of 11.1%, was completely out of context. In the sense that even at that point in time, nobody can say that inflation would be 3.5%, which was assumed. The inflation, then it had to be explained by the finance minister that it was a GDP deflator and not the CPI or WPI. But when the CPI and WPI were going above 7 and 8%, I mean 7% CPI and more than 12% WPI, I mean there was no way you can have 3.5% GDP deflator inflation. Now, if you say that you make this assumption and they are out of window within 1 month, I am surprised. It should be out of window in 1 day. Sir, it cannot be sustained at all. This brings me to the question about the fiscal marksmanship, which makes the entire budgeting exercise, the way it is being done, into a big question mark. Ultimately, you are only talking about the fiscal deficit and the debt. Now, in the past, I have through several papers, I have made a point that in Indian situation, it is the growth which takes care of most of these problems. Like say, for instance, if you are having the debt GDP ratio rising to something like 90%, it is only because the growth was absolutely absent, and in fact, it was negative. The moment growth became positive, the debt GDP ratio started falling and coming down. Now, to say that it should come down to 60 or 70%, which is a target kind of a level, which is again not a very healthy and very justified target at all. In fact, the fiscal panel had given the target of 55% without any justification at all. And therefore, 3% as the fiscal deficit target, it doesn't make sense at all. In an economy which grows at the rate of 7.5% on an average, I mean, you don't expect the fiscal deficit, the fiscal deficit target to be 3% or 2.5%. Now, it doesn't make at all any sense. When you consider the combined fiscal deficit target was given by the fiscal panel to be 5%, and the original target was 6%. Even if you consider 6%, it is too conservative. It doesn't make sense at all. Now, in this context, I would rather like to highlight one very important thing. We are talking about many things that the budget is expected to deliver. But what the budget is delivering requires you to appreciate that there is a committed expenditure component. Sir, committed expenditures in this country is 7.5%. And you add to that 1.5% of the defense expenditure, it makes it 9% of GDP. And your total revenue receipt, including the non-debt capital receipt, is less than 9%. That means that it is only the fiscal deficit which provides the room for discretionary expenditures. It is only the fiscal deficit. The moment you cut the fiscal deficit, your discretionary expenditures are cut. Whether it is a revenue expenditure, whether it is a capital expenditure, discretionary expenditures will be cut. Now, if you cut the discretionary expenditure, I fail to understand how the growth can be revived. We can only consider the shift from the public expenditure to the private expenditure, encouraging that thing, but that means that we have to be extremely careful in not cutting the expenditure beyond a point. I mean, if you make it 3% of the GDP, sir, 3% will be your discretionary expenditures. Your capital expenditure will be less than 3%, because a part of the discretionary expenditure will have to be revenue expenditure. And I am only including food subsidy as a part of the committed expenditure. The other two subsidies, I mean, the other speakers have made this point, but let me tell you, the total of the fiscal, the subsidies of the petroleum subsidies and fertilizer subsidies is only 0.43% of the GDP. How much you can cut and how much you can reallocate? I have no idea. I mean, I have no answers to that. Only I can say that unless we are realistic in our approach, unless the government becomes realistic in this, we have no hope in a sense. That is, hope in the sense of meeting the 5 trillion target of the economy by 26-27, or by having the target of something like 10 trillion economy by 34-35. We are not having the hope in this case. That means that we have to be realistic. We have to be compromising with certain things. I mean, 4% inflation target, I can't justify it. There is no way. In fact, 4% inflation target doesn't make sense to me at all. If we relax this kind of things and make some realistic assumptions about the growth and the inflation, then we can hope for something like 13 to 14% nominal growth. The moment we talk about 13 to 14% nominal growth, sir, most of the fiscal problems and most of the debt problems will automatically get solved. I think that is where I will stop. Now, let us invite the questions from the floor. I hand it over to Charan Singh for.
This has been a great talk today, and I'm sure there are going to be many more questions coming, and we invite questions. So please raise your hand or put it in the chat box. There is already one in the chat box, but you please feel free to ask your questions. I had a couple of questions, Professor. One of it was, we all get interviewed in papers and channels and all that. One question that often comes is, how do we now, or what do we suggest to the FM that the investment starts rising again? As you know, the private investment has especially taken a dip, so much so that the FM in one of these recent meetings ask the private sector, what more should we do? We are encouraging you in all ways, and still there is such a dip that is taking place in private investment. And what do we do? How do we kickstart the economy if private investment is not there? So I think that is one question which we need to really look at. And some of you mentioned that issue. What do we do for generating employment? Now, on one hand, some of us feel, and rightly feel, that there's a global gloomy environment. There's a slowdown, self-invited recession in the advanced countries. So 45% of our exports are going to be impacted immediately. What do we do in the face of this? Or we were to recommend to the FF, what would we recommend that she should do so that our manufacturing continues on a positive trajectory? The other thing which was raised, and I thought it was very important, was the medium-term fiscal plan. Now, at least that gave us a link with the future. And in such an uncertain time, how do you handle that part? Because many times I wonder, Professor Dholakia and Professor Pinaki, you've been at the helm of affairs and you've been part of the finance commissions. And many times I wonder, we have the GST Council, and then we have the 5-year earmarked resources coming, and then the GST Council tinkers with the rates, and then the Finance Commission has already made a 5-year projection and spoken about the direct taxes to be transferred, must be under some assumption of GST, and those rates get tinkered and the slowdown takes place, and GST is the first one because the commodity based, it takes a dip. How do you reconcile the two, and what do you do with the states? The other issue, which I thought was very important, has been flagged today, and maybe some elaboration can be given either by Professor Pinaki or Professor Upinder, because both of you have worked with the finance commissions extensively, is in the horizontal equity. I mean,
Finance. Our finance minister is presenting the budget under the compulsions of growth recovery and diminishing fiscal space, where we can expect her only to present a very orthodox budget with increased priming, and if at all there could be some innovation, we can expect her to change a little bit in the tax slabs and then increase the tax exemption. But as far as public expenditure is concerned, I see a lot of pump priming, particularly in the areas of infrastructure, orthodox areas of physical infrastructure, and then social infrastructure in the area of education, where NEP provides more scope for pump priming in IT spaces. We can also expect rise in the public expenditure in railways, drinking water, sewerage, urban and rural infrastructure, which abound in their needs for increase in pump priming. But then I would advise her to pump in more funds into the rural sector through the Finance Commission, which would be more intelligent, and then go for market borrowing if at all. The funds are flush with the government, but then we have more corporate funds. In this direction, the IMF has already projected that there will be a spiraling fall in tax rates and also increase in public expenditure, which we can advise her to increase public expenditure in school education, particularly where rural infrastructure is lacking.
Dr. Rekha, may I request you to come to a specific question to the specific panelist? That would be better.
Agricultural technical infrastructure could be invested in, like in artificial intelligence and machine learning, where employment is certainly declining. And in these areas, we could divert the labor into other areas by introducing AI and ML through incentives
Dr.
in the
Rekha,
form of public
Dr.
expenditure.
Rekha, what is your exact question and to whom? What is your exact question, specific question, and to whom? Which of the participants?
Which are they? There could be investments in Swaminathan Commission, for instance, has already suggested that we could go for investment in
Dr. Rekha,
crop pattern introduction and
Dr.
education.
Rekha, I'm asking you, what is exactly your question, specific question?
What is the risk?
What is your specific question to which of the speakers?
Which Congress?
Professor Charan Singh, Dr. Charan Singh.
Yeah, Professor Rekha is a
Yeah.
former member of the Karnataka State Planning Board, and I
Yes.
think, and I think she was making some general observations, contributing in the discussion. I think that is what she's
Okay,
attempting.
Okay.
But Professor Rekha, we would request you to be little brief because there are questions waiting to be answered.
Now, in Karnataka, they could, divert, the finance minister could introduce more funds into the rural areas only through the finance commission, as I expect. Otherwise, direct injection into the rural sector through public expenditure is only in the direction of physical infrastructure, where we have a lot of inadequacies in the form of roads, railways, drinking water, sewerage, and urban and rural infrastructure. Otherwise, in social infrastructure, we always have increasing need for school education. That's what I said, where we can see more pump priming through public expenditure. However, tax GST could be rationalized, where a lot of confusion has been created with GST, which needs rationalization, and the tax slabs in the upper end need to be further increased, and the exemption limit could be increased. These are the possibilities with the compulsions of the finance minister under the very nascent growth recovery and diminishing fiscal space. But then market borrowing by the corporate could be encouraged by giving incentives and attaching it to accountability, which can also be seen there.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Charan, do we have any other question?
Yes, we have a couple of questions on the
Yeah,
chat
please.
box, and I thought some of them are reasonably good. Let me just read one of them. And this is, will the future budgets likely to aim to become manufacturing hub of the world, eventually competing with China if India grows and becomes the industrialized country in coming decades? That is one question. And then the other
Just one
question
second.
was,
Ajit, would you like
Yes.
to?
May I? So one of the points I think that was raised by Dharmakirti Joshi, by Dr. Joshi, was that with the developed world being 45% of exports and things over there slowing, which all of us are in consensus, we're going to see a slowdown, that things might not be that rosy for India. So one of the things that we actually think would be offsetting some of that is the fact that the pandemic and some of the supply constraints that we saw from the pandemic has exposed the massive risks that the world has with concentration to the Chinese economy. So across some of the basic building blocks of the world economy, they have found now that over 60% market share, you're looking at steel, you're looking at aluminum, you're looking at APIs, you're looking at many sectors, was to China. So the world right now, even though demand is slowing, the opportunity for India and a few other countries is the diversification of risk. So one of the advantages and one of the reasons why the PLI, I know Dr. Joshi talked about pulling in future revenue with the PLIs. But one of the things about the PLI is also that it is to help Indian enterprises get to global scale. And by Indian enterprises, I mean whether it's a foreign enterprise in India or an Indian enterprise set up by Indian promoters in India. But the Indian manufacturing industry can actually ramp up scale in sectors. There are 14 sectors already announced by the government, is to improve that relative scale, and even the sort of investment in infrastructure that we are seeing, like the railway thrust, etc., is to improve the efficiencies and logistics and competitiveness. So these two factors, scale of enterprise is a huge historical issue in India because we like to keep things small. We've, redefined the MSMEs by an order of magnitude 50 times, and sometimes, to some. We have the PLI schemes, and you have this massive infrastructure investment to offset some of the impact that should help to offset some of the impact of the slow end markets, because there is a shift that is happening. And that shift, India was not the best position to capture it based on competitiveness. We no longer had to compete with China's cost and scale, but the number 2, number 3, number 4 countries that we are competing with, Vietnams of the world, the Malaysias of the world, the Indonesias, Thailands. And for that, what we have done is we have said we will pay you until we become as efficient and get scale. That's part of the incentive of the PLI. So I think we are making some progress over there. And I think that because of our depth and breadth of our labor markets as the largest and the broadest labor pool in the world after China, and the largest English labor pool, if you have a look at it over the next few years, English speaking, I think we have tremendous opportunity to actually become, despite having these smaller competitors, they don't have the same depth and breadth of labor market we do, even though they might be in the short run more competitive. With the PLIs and with some of the other investments the government is making, I think in the next 5 years, we could land up very competitive and a true alternative to the China plus one strategy for the globe. That should, sort of offset some of that weakness.
Okay, thank you. Charan, any other question?
Yeah, there is one more question, which is talking about if we want to generate demand, but then there is the fear of inflation. How do you reconcile the two? Would we then land up in an inflationary phase?
Great.
And then another question is, then should we also be thinking in terms of investing in R&D?
Okay. Professor Bhalla, would you like to answer the first one?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. There seems to be a contradiction. There is talk of a recession, global slowdown, things going to get worse. And at the same time, that we need to counter inflation by and how do we generate demand? First, if anybody's call of a recession turns out to be accurate, then what we have is the opposite of inflation. We have a further declining inflation. If it is not a recession, global recession, then we need to answer as to why or how will inflation reignite when inflation is coming down now around the world because of supply considerations having eased. China joining the world again, etc. So I think, I certainly don't see a connection between global recession or non-recession and inflation or non-inflation. Inflation is something that is globally determined, and I believe not that much by money supply or by the interest rates that global policymakers seem to love and follow. So to me, they are two very distinct things. And I, as I said before, I believe inflation is trending down regardless of what happens to global growth.
Thank you. May I request Dharmakirti to answer the second one about the R&D, and you are on mute.
if we want to be a global player, I think R&D will be very important from an innovation perspective. I mean, so, and it's well recognized that we need to raise the R&D spending across the board. And I think what the budget can do here is to incentivize in some way the R&D spending by the companies. I think that's a short answer to this question. I mean, because we are talking in context of the budget.
Very good. Thank you. Any other question?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions, Professor Dholakia. One is directly for you, but there is another one which comes from your brief introduction, which says that what do you do about the freebies? How do you control it now? In the last 7-8 years, almost all political parties have been participating in the freebie culture. How to tackle this unholy menace, and how are we going to handle the fiscal disaster that freebies will lead us to? What are the tools that the policymakers have? The second question is directly towards you. It's Professor Sawhney asking that question. And the question is, if inflation target has to be compromised to an increased target of more than 4%, won't it create a demand side shock due to unaffordable prices at times of low employment? It may further translate into stagnation in economic growth, given that India is a demand driven economy. What can be the way out? So, probably these two questions are towards you. And then there is another one. What about the health sector? Is it increasing the budget? What are the scope in this regard?
Okay. I would first pass the last question to Professor Sawhney, the health budget, and you are on mute.
Yeah, so as I already mentioned, that in order to bring about positive changes in the health sector, some kind of tax concessions need to be given, as also GST needs to be reduced. And of course, we need to have a lot of private participation in health has come, but the level at which our country is, we still need to make a lot of public investment in health sector, which is now lagging behind. So I think the effort of the finance minister should also be directed towards increasing the health budget. I'm not too sure how she's going to tackle it in this budget particularly.
Thank you. Now the remaining two questions regarding, first one is regarding the freebies. I would rather like to say very categorically that freebie is not so much a problem in the central budget, the union budget, but it is more a problem of the state budgets. And I think that state budgets have to be seen very, very carefully. And most of the performing states, financially performing states, will have to abide by the discipline imposed on them through the Finance Commission and through the FRL. I think if you are not following those things, then freebies is a big issue. And I think I don't know how they are going to tackle, because the matter is that they have to abide by their own constraint of the fiscal responsibility legislation which they have passed, and the borrowing limits which are imposed by the Finance Commission through their entire award. I think it is that those two things will take care of this problem anyway. As far as the finance, as far as the compromising of the inflation targeting is concerned, is very clear. I think I'm not saying that you compromise with the finance, the inflation targeting in an ultimate sense. The question is that the inflation targeting is right now at 4% plus or minus 2%, which is a range. Is so long as the inflation falls within this range, it is not basically compromising in a genuine sense of the term. it is a, right now what is happening is that the 4% is taken as a very sacrosanct kind of a number. And therefore, most of the budget exercises, etc., are likely to be, I mean, targeting the inflation around 3.5% to 4.5% kind of a thing. Now, the threshold level of inflation, on the other hand, turns out to be around 5.5 to 6% for the country like India over a long period of time. Now, therefore, if the inflation targeting is actually done through the threshold level of inflation, which maximizes the long-term growth for the country like India, I think the numbers are, as per my research, shows it is 5.5% and for the inflation and about 7.5 to 8% for the growth, real growth. If these are the numbers that we consider, then we find that the nominal growth would turn out to be in the range of 13.5 to 14%. And it is that thing which should be taken into account. It doesn't really relax the problems. It doesn't make the problem crop up, in the sense that the demand led inflation is not getting into that thing at all. In fact, what happens is that this inflation will lead to higher growth, and higher growth necessarily means that when there is a shift in the demand, there is also a simultaneous shift in the supply, and it doesn't really create any kind of macro imbalances. So that is the answer. Do we have any other questions?
Yes, we have two questions. One is on the PLI scheme. And the question is, should the PLI scheme be extended to the shipping lines? That is one.
I think that question was very, very adequately answered by Pai when he was addressing the first question. I think we can take the next question. Yes.
We can. Yeah, there's a question from Subrit Kumar Nishanka. I can't understand the question if he's in the audience. Mr. Subrit Kumar, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, sir. Sir, very good evening, one and all. I'm Subrat Kumar Nishank from AVNC University, Padodara. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are.
Sir, my question is to previously the project of the DISA. So one of the project is when it was taking 28 projects at the convergence, both state and central projects. But now it has extended 74 schemes submerges with the different states and central governments. So how is to look into this one? So I want to know about the details. So
I understand. Any of the speakers volunteer? Because I don't think that this is the kind of details we have addressed. But anyway, is any of the speakers volunteering to answer?
Yeah.
DISA project, sir. Thank you, sir.
I don't think that is
more need for investment in agricultural R&D, which is very opportune at this moment, given the larger multiplier effect on growth and employment. There should be more pump priming into R&D, particularly in the area of agriculture, for updating technology and then diverting the unemployed and underemployed labor into the other areas, which can be done right now by the finance minister through innovative measures to inject R&D expenditure, diverting it towards the corporate who are flush with funds. That can be done through incentives, small incentives provided, which have multiplier effect. But then what is called for under her compulsions is to change the tax scenario where she has a limited scope. GST needs to be rationalized extensively, which would be a good contribution by the finance minister at the moment. And then there is also need for change in the tax slab. The upper slab has to be added with one more slab, or more measures have to be taken to bring in the funds that escape through the upper slab. So we can expect we
Okay.
actually
Thank-
expect the finance minister to make changes in this direction, but she has limited scope due to increase in corporate powers and then decline in the powers of the government, because government just is a derived body, and whatever else
Thanks.
we cannot
Thanks.
directly produce. So agriculture and industry have to
Thanks.
promote.
Thank you. Okay. Now, Charan, do you have any other questions or anything?
There are no more questions here.
Okay. Now,
I had one.
you know, I would rather like to point out, because, you know, when I was talking about something, I think I saw question marks in Dharmakanti's, Dharmakirti's eyes regarding the committed expenditures. Now, just to
Government
clarify,
gets funds from the private sector.
Just to clarify, the committed expenditures, I would include interest payments. Okay, interest payments are 3.65% of GDP. Pay and pensions together is a committed expenditure. It is 1.85% of the GDP. Subsidies, and I include only food subsidies because it is a part of the act and it is legislation. Therefore, it is a committed expenditure. You cannot do anything with that. It is 0.8%, 0.80%. Then there are Finance Commission grants to states, which are also committed for the union government. It is 0.74% of the GDP. And you have GST compensation fund, that the contribution to that is again a committed expenditure, and that turns out to be 0.47% of GDP. Sir, if you add up all these things, it becomes 7.51% of GDP. And add to that 1.49% of the defense expenditure, that makes it exactly 9% of GDP. So in case you had the question in your eyes, which I could read, so I am just giving you the answers. Now,
Sir, thanks for that. Just very briefly,
Energy efficiency can be encouraged. Investment in
Dr. Rekha, let Dr. Joshi talk. Yeah.
no, I think, sir, I was just, when we also do this committed expenditure thing, I think my assessment was that around 40% of the total expenditure is committed expenditure. Maybe you're saying it's more. Yeah.
No, it is 7.51% committed in terms of all this. And if you add 1.49% defense, you can't compromise with that. It becomes 9%, and 9% is higher than 8.54%, which was budgeted for the revenue receipts, and 0.31% budgeted for the non-debt capital receipts. I think if you make it, then the whole thing is that all discretionary expenditures, including the petroleum subsidy, including the fertilizer subsidies, are derived out of the fiscal deficit only.
Right. No, I think you have a broader definition of probably, which is right, of committed spending.
No, I'm talking about the kind of the degrees of freedom that the finance minister would enjoy.
Right, sir.
I put myself in her foot and try to see what can be done. And it is only out of the fiscal deficit that I can fund the development. There is no other way. There is no other way. So therefore, cutting the fiscal deficit down to 3% is ensuring that we should not we stop growing. That is the point, because we will not be able to meet the infrastructure deficit. As Ajit was talking about, infrastructure deficit is a very serious matter. Sir, we can bring the private sector into it, but some portion, some basic things has to be provided by the state, by the government, and that is where our degrees of freedom are extremely. Yeah, Professor Bhalla.
Yeah. You know, I mean, taking your point further and the discussion, I've, excuse me, sorry, I've yet to see a study either in India or outside of India which shows that the size of the fiscal deficit or changes in the fiscal deficit affect inflation in India. So, in other words, we have casual, I wouldn't even say casual empiricism, casual conventional wisdom, which says that the fiscal deficit should be brought down because we need to bring down inflation. So if somebody can point me, not necessarily here, I would.
So may I interject over here?
Yeah, please.
So, Dr. Bhalla, the point that was made was not for inflation when we talked about the fiscal deficit. The point that I'd made was on cost of capital. The moment the government debt to GDP goes very high, and you have. So I agree completely with your point, Dr. Bhalla, about the inflation targeting, and the same with Dr. Dholakia. I think we are too conservative. But overall cost of capital for the Indian economy goes very high when the state deficit is very high and the sovereign debt to GDP is extremely high. The way China has done it, or many other countries, is they kept sovereign debt to GDP low. They allowed private debt to rise. Since all debt is referenced to the sovereign, 50 basis points, 100 basis points higher, if you actually are more disciplined on the debt side for the government, what you tend to do is drive down your cost of capital and speed up your economic growth because you're getting greater private investment. So it wasn't necessarily the inflation.
Let me rephrase my point as follows. If the RBI were not to increase interest rates as it has been increasing, right? And may even have to, let's just do that counterfactual. Would inflation rate today, 6 months from now, be higher or lower? So in other words, what I am contesting is that basically in today's day and world, inflation is determined overseas. We have precious, our monetary policy or anybody's monetary policy, including the Fed, has precious little to do with inflation. That was the old thinking. That was the thinking 20 years ago, 30 years ago, etc. And that's why I alluded to the experience of the last 25 years prior to 2019, where countries, including the US, including India, etc., said that, oh, we got to contain the fiscal deficit and we got to contain inflation and therefore we got to raise interest rates. You know, I just want to see, I mean, all I'm asking for, in theory, I can make any model relating them or not relating them. So forget theory, just show me empirically where that has been the case. And I'll give you an explanation as to why Fed governors and our governors, etc., do what they are doing. They want to have, they know inflation is coming down, okay, because of what I believe are various exogenous forces. And inflation comes down, okay, देखो जी, हमने interest rates बढ़ाए थे और इसलिए वो inflation आ गई है, हमने बहुत अच्छा काम किया. This is starting from Mr. Powell, okay? All I'm contesting is, I want to see some evidence. That's all. So if inflation is coming down, I believe inflation is globally determined. Precious little even the US can do about it. And I think they are also caught in a time trap. We are so globalized today. Anything that happens anywhere affects everywhere else. So we need to start rethinking our approach to global and domestic macro. That's all I'm contesting.
Can I
Just
take
like
a point?
just to finish, just like on, we need to change about whether we should have a budget day when everything is discussed. We should discuss it throughout the year and monetary policy and fiscal policy is made throughout the year and has precious little to do with and interest rates, and monetary policy has very little to do with inflation. But that's my.
Thank you very much. But Professor Bhalla, I have my marginal kind of disagreement, because fiscal policy has to be an annual affair. It cannot be a regular thing, for the simple reason that fiscal policy, whatever you do, government expenditures or revenues, will have to be formally approved by the parliament. It cannot be done without approval of the parliament. There is something, this is a, unfortunately.
What we had, the latest example being from the debt talks in the US, that also has to be approved. वो फिर अप्रूव हो जाता है, डेट लिमिट भी बढ़ा देते हैं, ये वो पता तो कुछ नहीं ना पड़ा. That's what my point is. वो तो हमने करना है, वो तो पार्लियामेंट से अप्रूव हो रहा है ये वो, but don't link these.
Anyway,
like
Professor,
they've given up linking.
Yes, Dr. Chakraborty, you were not there, so I did not involve you in some of the things. But tell me, what?
No, I was there. My camera was off. I have got a very unstable internet today. So yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah, I am. I'm listening to the discussion very carefully. No, I have got. When I said fiscal deficit should be correction should be front loaded, and debt to GDP ratio should decline, the primary reason for that was that the large part of the committed expenditure is interest payments. So the 8 or 9% that you were also referring to, sir, almost 50% is interest payments. So 3.65% of GDP
correct
is interest.
Correct.
So if we have an ever rising debt stock, it's very difficult to release resources for primary expenditure. That's the first point. So we need to correct our debt. That is the first point. From the second point is the general government debt, which I haven't talked about because we are talking about central budget. So if you look at general government debt, the correction, the composition of general government debt, if we look, 80% of the general government data is at the central level. So and only 20%, of the 100% general government debt. So the fiscal correction has to have that composition, that structural rigidity of general government debt in mind. So center needs to do bigger correction. That's the second point I wanted to make.
No, point well taken, sir. Yeah. But I have my disagreement with that, Pinaki. I have my disagreement.
Okay.
But just because before you go to the next point, see, as far as I am also aware about the fact that there is a loop which builds. If the debt is increasing, the interest payments increase, and the committed expenditures increase, and all other kind of things, and that becomes the loop for the debt trap. Fortunately for us, because our growth rate is pretty high and reasonably stable, therefore, what has happened is that if you apply a Domer equation, sir, the sustainable debt level turns out to be not 55%, but turns out to be something in the range of 72 to 73%. Now, if you consider 72 or 73% as the sustainable debt, then you work back and you find that the sustainable fiscal deficit, combined fiscal deficit, works out in the range of 9% and not 6% and 5%. Sir, if it is a 9% fiscal deficit, the fiscal correction required by the state is not to the tune of going down to the 4.5% or something. You can have the fiscal deficit at something like 5.5%, and the state governments can have the rest of it, and you have the same kind of a matter you can actually have, because these numbers are not calculated scientifically. If you apply the Domer equation and all that, you get completely different pictures, sir. Anyway, now the next point, sir.
Yeah, sir, Domer equation is certainly the sustainability condition, but also it would require a declining primary deficit unless the debt and growth effective
Sure.
and the effect of primary deficit. And secondly, we have 6.4% of GDP as center's fiscal deficit, and state has around 3.4. So we are already above 9. So from that point of view, also fiscal correction is
Sure. We need to, but not to the extent to which you are saying. That is the only thing. That is the only thing that I was making.
So that second, on the question of capital expenditure, I think center's ability to make a large increase in capital expenditure is limited given large revenue deficit center has, and this large revenue deficit of center is not primarily because of subsidies. It is because of interest payment, which is 3.65, and centrally sponsored scheme, which is around 2% of GDP. That makes it the revenue deficit figure, that is 5.5. So you also look at transfer in the form of central schemes to the state, not as whether this scheme has more allocation or that scheme has a less allocation. When the budget is presented, I think we should look at centrally sponsored schemes allocation as a macro fiscal adjustment issue, because that is a structural political economic question of fiscal policy, whether center should be intervening and financing centrally sponsored scheme through borrowed resources. So, and then we come out with all these numbers called effective revenue deficit. This is capital expenditure at the state level, but revenue expenditure in my account, but basically it's a capital expenditure. I think that also brings in a lot of non-transparency. So I think what is required is reduction in debt, which will reduce interest payment, and also we need to restructure our CSS, the way we finance it, how much we should finance, where we should finance, and where we should withdraw. I think these are the structural rigidities of India's central finances and state finances, and budget can do a lot of things when it comes to the centrally sponsored schemes. Thank you.
That is well taken. Point very well taken. Thank you very much, Dr. Chakraborty. This is a very interesting point. Yeah, Dr. Charan Singh, yes.
Sirs, I am caught in a dilemma. As you know this, I'm going to share this. I'm going to share this with the ministry also, and they'll have the privilege of listening to the discussion that we are having today. One question that comes to my mind, and right from the beginning, is in this time, given the global difficult situation with exports going down and everything that we have discussed so far, should the government think of consolidating and reducing deficit, or should it continue to boldly go ahead and say, in the current economic situation, with global forecasts of next 2 years in a difficult time, recovery not taking place, the government is in for an easy fiscal policy?
There is no easy fiscal policy, Charan. As you know, we are going to tighten, we are going to bring down the fiscal deficit. The question is that of the extent. My disagreement with Pinaki was not in terms of not bringing down the fiscal deficit, not bringing down the debt GDP ratio. Sir, they require to be brought down. There is no doubt about that. But what is the speed with which we should do that? I think from 6.4%, we can think in terms of having, say, something in the range of 5.8 to 6% in this budget. I would say it is a good fiscal consolidation. The path is there, and we are following that path. But when you bring down, it is a tighter fiscal policy. Please remember that, and it will have all the impact on the cost of capital, as Ajit was talking about. I mean, when the fiscal deficit is brought down as a proportion of the GDP, it will have the necessary impact of bringing down the real cost of borrowing. Now, the real cost of borrowing is I underline that point, because real cost of borrowing is to be obtained by nominal cost of borrowing minus the expected rate of inflation. And if the expected rate of inflation turns out to be something in the range of 4.5% or 5%, then to that extent, the real cost is really brought down. And I think that is where our strength lies. If you consider the kind of things, we do have this kind of strength. It is what is important right now is not to derail the economy from the growth momentum. Right now, there is a growth momentum. We should retain that, we should strengthen that, and we should not do anything to derail the economy from the growth momentum. If the economy becomes too slow, as Dr. Joshi was pointing out, I think there is a need to be worried about that the growth of GDP should not be 6%. It has to be around 7.5%. You cannot target 6% rate of growth. You cannot target 3.5% inflation or 4% inflation and talk about 10% nominal growth. Sir, with 10% nominal growth, you have absolutely no degrees of freedom. Anyway, these are my points. I think it's a time for us to stop the discussion. It is going to be very interesting, but let us wait for the budget. Budget will have better figures. We will be in a better position to discuss those things, given the numbers which are there. And I would very strongly plead that the numbers will have to be seen in the context of the GDP which is assumed. I fully agree with Dharmakirti that those numbers which are assumed may be thrown out of the window probably within next 24 hours of their assumption. But I think it is better to talk about those matters because it is the relative position numbers as a percentage of GDP that would make sense in the macroeconomic impact of the budget. Thank you very much, and I hand over the things to Dr. Charan Singh to conclude.
Yeah, thank you very much, all of you, for coming to this forum and discussing these issues. As I said, we'll be sharing this presentation tomorrow with you, of course, on our website. And with the officials, I would like them to also get a feel of what economists were thinking. It's going to be a very tightrope walk, as we have just discussed. And as the discussion proceeded, we all realized that it's going to be a very, very razor edge situation. Global situation grim. We want to do the consolidation that is necessary, but to keep the employment going and investment going high, private sector not doing it, should the government be doing it in the capex? All those issues are going to play a very important role. I'm sure in the ministry they would have probably made the macro model. Today is 27th. Probably their figures are already solidified and getting printed, and we look forward to what we have to then analyze when on 1st of February the figures are out. I'm going to request each of the panelists and each of the participants who have been here today to please join us again on February 3. February 1 is the budget. We would have analyzed, all of us would be on different channels, I know. We would have analyzed. February 2, we would have analyzed and digested. February 3 is when we meet. Probably would have also by that time gone through the data in a more solid way, and then more rigorously we'll be able to do this discussion. So I would invite all of you, same time on February 3, we are all meeting together, analyzing the hard data that will be there in the budget. For today, I want to thank each one of you for being here and making the discussion so rich and relevant. Thank you, and see you soon next week.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.